Welcome into another edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I am joined, as always, by my co-host Jeff Cohen. We are back. It's been a couple weeks. We had an awesome episode you should definitely check out with Scott Merkin of MLB.com a few weeks ago, talking about everything he knows within the White Sox, intel on the roster, spring training, offseason stuff, all of the above. So that was really cool. We're back now in February. This is the month where we actually get to watch baseball, whether it be spring training or not. This is the time where we finally get to pivot and start watching real baseball. So we figured it was a good time to kind of just check in with everyone here and see where everyone's head was at. So we are doing our first edition of a mailbag episode. Shout out to the guys over at Just Baseball that I work with who do these mailbags every month. And I always really enjoy hearing the vast amount of questions that listeners ask. So I put it on Twitter earlier this week and then reached out to a few people that I know that like to ask questions as well, just to put questions out there, see what people wanted to know and wanted to hear me and Jeff talk about. So we're going to do that today. We're going to go through a bunch of questions from people that listen to the show and just talk through all these different cool questions about the White Sox organization and the prospects and on everything in between. But first of all, Jeff, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Elijah. I'm really looking forward to today's show. Just so folks know, you and I know the questions, but we haven't compared answers yet. So that'll be fun just to see where we agree and what differences we might have.
Yeah, 100%. It's going to be a good time. It's always fun to just kind of think about these various topics, think through them. I looked through the questions. I didn't even prepare full answers for some of them just because I like kind of thinking through it on the spot at times. But I have an idea of where I'm going with some of these. And we are just going to kind of talk through stuff. But, in terms of the White Sox right now, right, we're recording this on February 5th. We're a week and a half out from pitchers and catchers reporting next week. And then beyond that, when everybody will be in spring training in a few weeks and games start in just a little over to just around 3 weeks now, less than 3 weeks actually, for spring training games starting. So we're right there. Jeff and I are going to be in Arizona in the beginning of March. So we're going to be doing a lot of in-person coverage, talking to prospects, players, watching games, watching the backfields, bullpens, all that type of stuff. Super exciting. I've done it the past 2 years. It's been my third year in a row doing White Sox stuff at spring training. It's a blast. We have a great time with it. And it's also really cool to just see kind of where the team's at, where the energy's at, where the franchise is at, and where, this next wave of White Sox talent that we keep seeing. Sox Fest Live, I'm not in the area. Neither of us are in the Chicago area, so neither of us were able to be there. But I know James and Ian were both there. Seemed like it was a great event. Seemed like it was very prospect focused, which I love to see. And I think the organization is further leaning into their status right now and focusing on the future of this team.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great sign.
Yeah, 100%. So as we get ready for this season, let's kick it off. We've got a bunch of great questions. I think we've got 9 or 10 questions from listeners today that we're going to go through one by one. We'll start with some ones about some specific players, and then we'll dive into some other things about, generally the future direction going forward, some other things to, some sleepers to look out for, all those types of things. So we will kick it off with our first question. And this comes from the Southside Boys on Twitter. Very supportive of us always. We appreciate you guys over there. Their podcast is great as well. Check them out. And their question was, which player or prospect do you predict will take the largest strides in terms of progression at the plate this upcoming season? I will let you start with this one, Jeff. So we're talking about a prospect within the White Sox system who will take the largest strides in terms of their progression as a hitter.
All right. That's a great question from the Southside Boys. And you're right, very supportive. We appreciate their support
100%.
of FutureSox. I'm going to preface it by saying, as a guy who goes to watch 3 of the 4 affiliates every summer, I'm going to be really curious to see the changes, if any, from the new director of hitting, Ryan Fuller. He replaces Alan Zinter, who replaced Andy Barkett. And clearly a change in hitting philosophy is something that the White Sox need at the major league level, given their poor plate discipline and lack of walks. And of course, so all that starts in the minor league. So I'm going to be really anxious to keep an eye out for that. But to answer the question, this is the year for guys like Wes Kath and Samuel Zavala to take a step forward. It's big years for both of those guys. And I would add Caden Connor and Ryan Galaney to that list. But my answer goes to Caden Connor. I think he is going to get to Birmingham, and my hot take is he's going to end up as one of the top 10 hitters in the league. How's that for a hot take, Elijah?
In Double-A?
Yep.
Wow, that's a take for sure. I like Caden Connor. That's definitely not the direction I was going. That's an interesting kind of path there that you took. What is it about Connor that you see being kind of that next step for him after, he's only played one full professional season, right? This is a guy that was drafted in 2023, coming off of a strong season in Kannapolis, was decent in Winston-Salem, but, still kind of showed some signs of development in Winston.
Right. Well, you're right. He and I compare he and Ryan Galaney. They both tore it up in Kannapolis. They're both college bats and advanced hitters. They go to Winston-Salem. Ryan struggled a lot more than Connor. Caden struggled a little bit, but seemed to start to find his way toward the end of the year. I just think he showed a lot of promise in Winston, and I think he just takes it to the next level next year. I think he's maybe spends a quarter of the year in Winston, and then hopefully, he's doing so well that they rush him up to Birmingham.
Yeah, I like it. Well, that's a solid answer. Not the direction I was expecting you to go, but I like it. I like the idea. I think some of those 2023 guys, right? There's a good amount of those college experience guys from that class, whether it's Galaney, Connor, Eddie Park, a handful of other guys that we are waiting to kind of. We saw them last season, right? But it's your first season in the minors, getting adjusted, getting used to the long season. I think this year you could see a lot of those guys really start to find their groove in the minors. For me, I think the easy answer is George Walkow, just because there's so much. It's not that he wasn't good last year, right? He showed at 18 years old that he has a ridiculous amount of power, but there's so much growth for him to do in terms of his approach and his style of hitting, right? I think that you could see him really take a massive step forward when you see that approach come into hand, when he limits the whiff, starts to have a little bit better, ability to chase, to discipline against some of the breaking balls, right? Like, I think his approach could really grow this season, which will make him that much better of a hitter. And he's already a very good hitter, right? So I think that's kind of the most straightforward answer that I thought of, because I think that there's just so much upside there that he is going to keep growing. And I believe this season you're going to see him make some really big strides. I have two others that are definitely more under the radar. Ryan Burroughs, I know that's a guy that we've both liked for a long time. We really like his defense at shortstop. Last season, the offense just never really came together, but he was working through some swing changes. He adjusted his mechanics mid-season. He was switching up his weight transfer a little bit, trying to change the way he was kind of working through the zone. I think there were some signs that he has more in the tank there. We didn't see a lot of production for him offensively, but come the playoffs in Kannapolis, he started to show some really good signs of stuff. He had some big clutch hits. He looks like he's finally comfortable with his swing. He talked to both of us in Candy in August about how he's figured out this new swing, and he feels more comfortable than he used to. Burroughs is a guy with a lot of talent. He was kind of a top 20, 25 prospect for the White Sox, a handful, going into last season, right? And I think he could easily get back into that range, even though he's not really a top 30 guy right now. I think he could easily push his way back into the top 30, given he's still very young. He plays a really nice infield at shortstop and second base. And I think there's a lot more offensive upside for him to tap into. And then the other one that you kind of hit on there a little bit, Samuel Zavala. I don't think I'm ready to give up on him yet. I think there's a lot that needs to be done for Zavala, but I do think, given his approach and his ability to just maintain consistent at bats last year, even when he was kind of struggling at the plate, right? He still walks a lot. He still has some quality speed, right? I think we could see him finally start to tap into some more of that power that he flashed in 2023 with another year at high A, if he can really just adjust to the level. But I really think my two answers are Walkow and Ryan Burroughs there, who I think will take that next step forward from the flashes they've shown already.
Yeah, good answers for sure. With regard to Ryan, yeah, he struggled all year, but he was an animal in the playoffs. He really
Yeah.
teased us, and we got a chance to see what the upside could look like. So it's going to
Yeah.
be really exciting to see what he does the start of this season. So, yeah, I agree with you there completely.
Yeah, 100%. All right, that's a great first question. Moving on to our second one. It's from our guy Dylan at Not Cease on X, one of our hosts of this show and a FutureSox contributor, always coming in with the heat. Dylan asked, who from the 2024 draft class are you most looking forward to watching this season? Plenty of answers here. You've got 19 answers in addition to some undrafted guys as well, or 20 answers in addition to some undrafted guys. So last year's draft class, right? A lot of these guys got a taste of single A. A few got a taste of high A last year, but a handful have not played at all. So who are you looking forward to from this 2024 White Sox draft class?
Oh, wow. Couple of guys really are very interesting. But I'm going to start with Jackson Appel. I really developed a man crush on him. He played 3 weeks at the end of the year, and wow, was he impressive for the last 3 weeks of the season and into and through the playoffs. So I am hoping that they push him and he starts in Winston. I don't know. We'll see. But he was a really exciting player. And you would, let's to be fair, you'd expect these college guys to do well in low A, and he
Yeah.
really did. A couple other guys, we haven't yet seen Nick McLean, and he was a third rounder, an
Yep.
outfielder from Arizona State. So certainly looking forward to seeing him. And then the second round pick and the 43rd overall, Caleb Bonham. I just hope we get to see him in Kannapolis at some point next year. I know he's very young.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's impossible not to go with Bonhomer, and Dylan knows that. I know he asked the question, but Bonhomer's a guy that both of us were really excited about when they drafted. We were both, fired up to just see what that upside looks like. He was, a potential first rounder prior to the high school season, had an up and down high school season, but still was, one of the best players in high school baseball in the country. Looked like he could be, commanding that late first round type money. The White Sox ended up overslotting him in the second round, paid him even more than the slot value at that pick. He's just, I mean, we've heard nothing but good things. There was a few clips of him hitting well in Arizona, just in complex, scrimmages last fall before he got anywhere. The organization as a whole, like we talked to guys in Charlotte that rotational guys within the organization, coaches that love Bonhomer's upside, a lot of power, a really compact, sweet swing from the he's just a super exciting player. I think we're going to see him in Canny and the second half of the season. It could be if he really goes off in Arizona, like Walcott was last year, where he gets to Canny in May or June. But I also could see it not being till July or so. At some point, I think he's going to get to Candy because I think he's going to mash in Arizona in the complex league. And I think this is a guy, 19 years old. There's a lot to dream on for Caleb Bonhomer. And I think, he'll be 19 this entire season, plenty of time to grow, to develop. And I think this is someone we're going to be looking at as, one of the better prospects in this system fairly soon. Other than that, that's the straightforward answer. There's two more. I'm going to save one of these for the next question because I think he fits perfectly in the next question. But I am going to go with, some later deep pulls here. One being Blake Shepardson. Blake Shephardson's a guy that we've had on the podcast. I talked to him in the fall or, in the summer when he was drafted. This is a guy who threw, barely any innings his entire, college career, right? He didn't throw a lot of innings. He went to the MLB draft league last year, was pumping 98, 99, showed really impressive stuff and metrics, doesn't have a lot of innings backing, has experienced injuries throughout high school into college, right? Doesn't have the track record at all of many other players in this draft class. The stuff is electric. If Shepardson comes into this season fully healthy and gets to kind of just go after it in a bullpen role in Kannapolis, I think we're going to see some really impressive stuff from him. And I think he's a reliever. As a reliever, right, I don't think they're trying to make him a starter. I think as a reliever, he could be someone with his stuff, if he's healthy, that could move pretty quickly, honestly. Another one from that, late in the draft class, I think is going to be kind of cool to see is Phil Fox as well. We didn't get to see him in Kannapolis, another relief pitching prospect who was, phenomenal in Pittsburgh, had an excellent college career, has one of the most highly graded fastballs in the entire draft from last year. I think Phil Fox is a guy that, alongside Jefferson, both those guys in the bullpen are going to move quick, and we didn't get to see him last year, so I'm really excited just to see those guys throw some innings in Candy this year.
Yeah, when we talked about the draft right after it happened, you and I were both very enthused about the guys. And then we got to see several of them the last 2 weeks of the season in Kannapolis, and they looked really good. Sam Antonacci and several of those guys. So, to be honest, you and I probably agree, there are a ton of these guys we can't wait to get a longer look at. It was
100%. And it's going to come down to finding innings.
A really deep draft, really deep.
For sure. And it's a lot of college guys, a lot of guys with experience, but you want to see that translate to the next level. That's why I went with those guys, because those guys are guys we haven't seen yet. We saw a lot of them last year in Canny, but it's super exciting to think about all the guys that we haven't even seen play affiliated games yet and are going to get a chance to, even though, there's a lot of players that need innings and not a million innings to go around. So I think some of these guys will still be in Arizona probably throwing complex league innings to start the season just because you need to get innings. But at the same time, a lot of them, including Fox and Shepardson, hopefully, are going to be eventual guys in Kannapolis, whether it be to start the year or just at some point during the season, right? So those are the guys I went with from this draft class. I think the whole class is going to be really fun to watch. And, you really don't get a true sense of guys from a draft class in the year they're drafted, right? They play a few months and it's nice, but you don't really get to see who they are as a player until their their first full season, the year prior to them being drafted, right? So all these guys from this class are going to be super fun. Obviously, Hagen Smith as well. Like, we have to mention Hagen Smith. I know I didn't want to go with the super obvious obvious answer, but like Hagen Smith is going to be awesome. It's going to be like, the privilege for us of being able to watch and cover Hagen Smith and Noah Schultz every single week is going to be ridiculous. The two best left-handed prospects in all of baseball probably right now. So super exciting there. I think the whole class is going to be a lot of fun to get to watch. That leads us into a question that I said, I think this kind of relates to one of these players that we could be talking about here from this draft class. This is from Doug Wirtz, DW Wirtz on X, very good, follower of us. He always is listening to us. We appreciate you, Doug. And he asked, who do you think will be the fastest moving prospect this year? I have a very clear answer, but I want to hear yours first.
Go for it. I have a feeling we got the same answer.
It's Sam Antonacci. I don't see how it couldn't be. I really don't see how it couldn't be, and that's why I didn't bring him up with the last one. I think there's other guys you could mention too, but I didn't bring him up with the last thing because he could have been the guy I was looking forward to from the draft class too. But Antonacci being a guy that played JUCO, then at Coastal Carolina, one of the best contact bats in the entire draft, 5th round pick from last year, finished the season in Canny with the numbers are silly. I don't remember. I'm going to pull them up right now while we talk about this, but like his numbers were just like ridiculous so far in Kannapolis. I mean, he had a 333 batting average with a 471 on base percentage, OPS over 900 last year in Kannapolis to start his professional career. Again, 23 games, right? But 17 walks, only 13 strikeouts, 7 stolen bases in those 20 something games. Just a pure hitter. And I think considering he's starting, in Kannapolis, he probably just goes straight to Winston this year. If you told me Sam Antonacci made it to AAA this year, I would not even blink. Honestly, I really would not be surprised at all. I think we're looking at a very similar trajectory to a Brooks Baldwin if things go well for Antonacci this year. It's a little bit of a stretch because Baldwin had a whole nother season. Antonacci, is there a world he's a September call-up? There's a world, honestly. I really do think there's a world. I don't think that happens this year, but I think he gets to Birmingham and very likely AAA this year, honestly.
Cool. I intentionally did not designate him for any of my answers because I knew, I know how fond you are of him, and rightly so. He was electric last year. So, good answer. I went with an even easier one. Lay up. I just chose Hagen Smith because he's gonna start in Winston perhaps and end up in Chicago.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think those are the two clear answers, at least from that draft class, right? In terms of guys not from the draft class, I like the idea of an Eric Adler, just because I think Adler getting an invite to spring training to big league camp, right? He was in Birmingham to finish the season. I think Adler's going to be in Chicago this year, right? So I think that 2 jump level, I can pretty much guarantee that as him jumping from AA to the big leagues this year. I think that's not, the biggest mover necessarily because it's only 2 levels as opposed to, Antonacci, who's starting in Canny last year and Hagen Smith, who only threw a few games in Winston, right? So those are obviously bigger risers, but I think both those guys are going to be pretty significant rising prospects. In addition to an Adler, I think there's a few others you could pull. You mentioned Jackson Appel earlier. I think there's a chance Appel could jump a level or two just because he has so much experience catching. I would not be surprised at all to see him jump some levels. There's a handful of other pitchers. I mean, is it crazy to say Aldrin Batista? That might be a little aggressive there. I don't think he jumps quite as quickly as a Smith or an Antonacci, but I do think Aldrin Batista, we've talked about him plenty. The people that listen to this, know how fond I am of Aldrin Batista for sure. I think Batista, finishing last season in Winston, I think there's a very good chance that you'll get him to Birmingham and probably not Charlotte, but I think he at least gets to Birmingham. And from there, you never know, right? If he dominates in Birmingham like he's capable of doing and like he did in Winston to finish last season, right? I could see him jumping another level from there.
Yeah. And as you and I have talked about, the White Sox don't want to have their top of the line pitchers spend much time in Charlotte. So
exactly.
It's not a big jump to go Birmingham to Chicago.
Exactly. I mean, Noah Schultz as well. I think that's that's only 2 levels, but I think Noah Schultz debuts this year if he's healthy. I don't really see how he wouldn't. I don't think what does an entire season in Birmingham do for Noah Schultz? We've already seen him dominate Birmingham last year, right? He will be there to start the year for sure. I don't think Noah Schultz ever touches Charlotte. I think there's no chance he plays a game in Charlotte. I think it sounded a little bit like Scott Merkin can see that similar path when we were talking to him about Noah Schultz as well. I just don't see him going to Charlotte, considering the way they handled Drew Thorpe and then some other pitchers as well. I don't see it. Maybe he does go to Charlotte, but I think Schultz will be up this year, jumping from Birmingham all the way to Chicago. Anybody else you thought of for fastest mover? I think we hit most of the
no, actually, the 2 I had thought about were Hagen Smith and Jackson Appel.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Going on to our next question. This comes from some family friends of mine who are big listeners and supporters, Abe and Aiden Kaplan. Thank you guys for sending me some questions because I reached out to some people asking if they had questions for the show. This one coming from them was something that was kind of frequently asked. A few other people mentioned the idea of, who are the guys we're going to see in Chicago this year, right? So Abe and Aiden asked, other than the two catchers, Colson Montgomery and Chase Meadroth, the two catchers being Caro and Teal, are there any position players White Sox fans might see in Chicago this year who could actually make a long-term impact on the Sox for years to come? This is a really good question because the biggest thing that we're trying to figure out right now and that we keep talking about is like, where is the positional depth and how can they keep adding to that? The Garrett Crochet deal was a big part of that, but there's more to come. So aside from Caro, Teal, Montgomery, and Chase Meadroth, Jeff, who are the other position players in the system that you could see making a big impact at the big league level?
Well, we just talked about a question from our pal Doug, and he asked a second question, which is similar to that. Who are some of the pitchers who are on the cusp of maybe making the major leagues? And more importantly, he said,
we'll get to that one.
right, but he also talked about the impact on the 40-man roster.
Right.
And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about who else could get the call, because there are only so many spaces. There aren't that many of these guys on the 40-man. But having said that, my quick answer is Tim Elko's at the top of the list, and long shot Mario Camilletti.
Interesting. Huh. What does Camilletti stand out to you as a guy who could, because the question particularly here was like, who could debut this year and who could also become an impact piece of the team? So what is it about Camilletti that kind of stuck out to you there?
I just think that there's such a muddle at the middle infield for the White Sox. No one has stepped forward yet. And assuming Colson doesn't open in Chicago, there's just a lot of positions and at bats at play. And I think maybe Camilletti can force his way up, but also I'm kind of thinking they may just turn to him in a pinch.
Yeah, I could see that as a possibility. I think because he's versatile. Camilletti's a guy who's played all over the infield. He's played some corner outfield as well, right? So like that's a guy that you could use as a depth piece. I think Tim Elko is probably the best answer here, just because he is older. He's and I don't. It's trending the direction of having a hard time seeing Andrew Vaughn being the long-term first baseman. So I think at some point Elko is going to get some run, whether it be at first base or DH, just to kind of give him the chance to see if he's a big league piece. It's still hard for me to envision Elko being a long-term impact piece. It's just tricky with his profile to really see it being long-term. But then again, he keeps hitting. I said this all of last year. He keeps hitting. If he keeps hitting the way he did last year, if he keeps doing what he could do, what he showed he could do in Charlotte, right? Like I think Tim Elko could be a legit option at the very least, like a platoon power hitting bat kind of type of guy, right? Like I think there's a possibility of that. Another one to think about is Jacob Gonzalez. I think there's still a lot of work for Jacob Gonzalez to do, but in terms of prospects who could debut this year, right? Like I think Gonzalez is a guy that at some point you kind of have to push him, right? I think he was a first round pick. He was supposed to be, one of the most big league ready kind of college bats in that draft class, right? So I think you could imagine a world where Jacob Gonzalez, if he has a really good start to the season in Birmingham, moves quickly through Charlotte and it gets to Chicago later in the season. And that's someone the White Sox still really want to be a big piece of this future, right? Last year was tough for him. He had some ups and downs. He adjusted his swing. He kind of got to Birmingham and struggled there a lot. But he had a great playoffs in Birmingham. He showed some good signs. He's changed up the way he approaches and the way he swings, right? Let's see what happens. I could see Gonzalez, with a good start to the season, quickly getting to Charlotte. Most people hit pretty well in Charlotte, or often hit pretty well in Charlotte, right? If he hits well in Charlotte, maybe he debuts later in the season. And that's a guy who you could kind of, envision being a potential long-term piece. There's a handful of others I can see, a little bit harder to imagine with some other guys. I think maybe a Wilfred Veras could debut this year because he's already on the 40-man, like we mentioned, with the 40-man being a little bit of a tricky situation there. Like is he not on the 40-man anymore? I think he might have been taken off the 40-man. I could be wrong there because he was on the 40-man at one point last season, but I don't think he is anymore, unless I'm wrong. So maybe not, but I think Averis is a guy that could be. I think Jacob Gonzalez is probably the best answer. Like I said, there's a chance Sam Antonacci debuts this year. That's the one that I think is a little far-fetched probably. It's probably a little too aggressive of me. But at the same time, if Sam Antonacci does debut this year, I could see him being one of those guys who makes himself, stick on this roster, right? In terms of the guys that are already on the roster too, like Brooks Baldwin's another one, Brian Ramos are another one, right? Like those aren't new guys, but I think there's a chance that they could kind of become, longer term pieces if they break out with more innings given to them this season.
Yeah, I think for the non-pitchers, I think it's a really short list,
It is,
other,
yeah.
other than the guys that,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah.
They pitched in the question. So to answer your guys' question, I mean, I think those four with Montgomery, Mead-Roth, Teal, and Caro are the four that you're going to be focused on this season for sure. I think those are the four guys you want to debut pretty soon this year. I mean, all four of those guys could have a case to be up by June, at this or earlier, honestly, for many of them. And I think those are the four that you're hoping are going to establish themselves this season in terms of the rookies that are going to debut. But Elko, Gonzalez, there's a handful of other guys who could make that impact and could at least become, utility pieces at the big league level or bench pieces at the big league level. So there's definitely some other options. Moving on to the next question, which is I combined a few. So this was Abe and Aiden asked this one as well. Doug asked a different version of this question. So this was kind of a combination of a few questions asked. Who do you think as pitching prospects could be traded for MLB potential hitting prospects or other MLB offensive help? And could you see any of these trades happening this year? This is a fascinating one. So I'll let you kick this one off, Jeff, because like we've said, there is some lopsidedness in the farm system right now. There's a lot of pitchers and probably too many pitchers at some point for the amount of innings the White Sox can use in a given season.
Well, it's an interesting question. And to be honest, I'm going to tell you flat out, I don't have a single guy who I'm going to name as is likely to be traded. I really have no idea who it's going to be. But I did take a look at the 40-man, and there are a lot of good young arms on the 40-man. Bush, Eater, Corolla, Martin, Cannon, Burt, Nastrini, Thorpe. There's a ton of guys.
Yeah.
I think where the crunch is going to come is in the next wave when Batista, Gowan, Schweitzer, some of these guys who are going to be Rule 5 eligible at the end of this season,
Yep.
that's where the crunch is coming, and that's where they're going to have to clean out some of the Bush, Eater, Corolla guys.
Yeah, I think it's going to get really tricky. And I love this question from the few people that asked different versions of it, and we combined it here because it's a hard thing to justify trading young talent when you're still rebuilding, right? You don't want to give up on guys and trade a guy for the sake of evening out your roster before your roster is at all competitive, right? So that's kind of this balance factor that you have to consider here for the White Sox is at what point is it too early to even consider moving talented players just for the sake of a better fit player at a different position, right? Like it's like you don't want to give up more talent just because you need another position. You want to still try to gain as much talent and accumulate as much talent as possible. There is a few guys that I thought of though, and you mentioned a few of them there. I think either a Jake Eater or a Kai Bush is a pretty likely one because those are guys that were at one point very high level prospects, right? They were both kind of borderline top 100 guys. They came over in trades to the White Sox, so they weren't homegrown players, right? I think both are trending towards more relief roles long term, right? Like Eater is already kind of looking like he's shifting into a bullpen role. Bush was starting last year, but I could definitely see him shifting into a bullpen role. I think those are two guys where it's like if the White Sox no longer have a spot for them and you're not sure they can find a spot, then it's like maybe another team wants to take that upside swing just because they both have a lot of natural stuff. They're both big left-handed guys. So I can see either of those two being kind of I don't want to say, a cast aside, right? But someone that you can say, oh, like, we don't really think it's working with these players. So another team can take a chance at that upside and we'll take another prospect back who's a little more, fits a different type of prospect. You're not going to get an elite hitting prospect for a Jake Eater or a Kai Bush, right? But you could get a hitting project that's equal level of a project to those players, right? Somebody that's a AAA guy that struggled and hasn't found his groove yet, hasn't been able to crack into the big leagues, but has upside that's kind of swapping an equal type of situation almost, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, and I'm glad you made that point because if you give, let's say, Jake Eater several more chances to start and it just never happens,
Right.
he's not going to have that much trade value other than his
Right.
pedigree as being a former top prospect. So yeah, you might be able to get something in return of another guy who was a top prospect
Yeah.
who struggled and see who can unlock
Right.
what. But you're
And
right.
then in terms of prospects, right? When you go a little bit deeper into the system and try to look at some of the, the depth arms in the system, I think in terms of one guy, again, it's really hard to say these trades will be made this year. I think if we see a type of trade where you're trading a prospect, it's going to be one of those older prospects, most likely, like an Eater or a Bush. It's hard to reason trading a younger guy who's still developing when this team is still far away from contending. If there was a guy, though, I can kind of envision a world where you trade a Juan Corella. And hear me out, because I know he's young. He's been really impressive, right? He was really good down the stretch last year when he got up to Birmingham, right? Corella, though, is still someone with some degree of reliever risk, right? I think there's still a world where he command-wise drifts into being a reliever eventually. In addition to the fact that he's coming off of a really strong finish to the season, right? So he showed some stuff at Double A where you're like excited about the potential of him, but already on the 40 man due to having to be added because of the Rule 5, right? So if you want to clear 40 man spots, there's not many guys that have more young upside in terms of pitchers, right, that haven't gotten to the upper levels or haven't reached the major leagues yet, who could actually return you legit hitting, upside, right? So I think if the White Sox see a moment to strike on a team that's looking to move a big league ready hitting prospect that they actually like, Corella is one of the few guys on the 40 man that could return a serious value in terms of a hitting prospect, if that makes sense too.
Elijah, I think that's a great take. You're right. As I look at the 8 or 9 young pitchers on the 40 man, he's the only one who either hasn't started to prove himself like
Right.
Cannon and maybe Burke, or has thrown a little bit of shade on himself like Nastrini and you know. So I think that's a good point. He still has a lot of trade value for sure.
Right. And it'd be risky, right? Again, it still feels a little too soon to trade a guy that's like young and has upside. But because he's on the 40 man, I can see a world where you justify trading him given his age and he still has some time to go for the sake of a hitting prospect that may become available suddenly. And you have to pounce on that, but you need to give up a decently talented young pitcher, right? There's also guys that aren't on the 40 man, right? Like you could look at a Tyler Schweitzer, a Riley Gowans, some of those other guys, that are good pitching prospects and had good seasons last year, but aren't on the 40 man yet. They probably are just too far down in the depth chart to get a chance at the big league level this year, right? So if you're not going to put them on the 40 man this year, maybe you look to move one or two of those guys for a young hitter with some, projectability, right? That you can probably make an impact on. But I think in terms of like, yeah, I don't think we see a lot of the second part of the question, right? Was could you see any of these happening this year? I don't think we see a lot of that this year. I think this year is more than anything just talent accumulation, no matter what the positioning is. Even if you do have too many pitching and too much pitchers and it's lopsided, right? You're probably not trading more than one or two of those guys potentially in a small move because you need to still just keep all your options open in terms of talent in the organization.
Yep, I agree. Yep, for sure.
All right, thank you guys for those ones. That was a great one. I love that. It's very interesting to consider given the kind of the shape of this farm system. The next one comes from Rosie Sports 88 on X as well. This one is something that I can't say I've done a ton of research on yet. I'm just kind of getting accumulated in this world. But Rosie Sports 88 asked, how does the top of the draft look for outfield prospects? It seems to be a weaker area than pitching or than infield and catching in the system as far as position players go. Very good observation there for sure from Rosie. I mean, I think that we've talked about for a while that the outfield depth is weaker than a lot of other areas of the farm system, but also you did just get a Braden Montgomery, right? So that immediately becomes your top outfield prospect, right? So that definitely helps in terms of trying to kind of build out the outfield depth. But yeah, I think this is a time where you have to try and get some outfielders. I think whether it's, high school guy, draft guy, the White Sox don't pick till 10th, unfortunately, because of the draft rules, right? So you can't really look at the top of the draft, right? There's two guys at the very top of the draft in Jace Laviolette and then Cam Canarella, who are two SEC, Clemson and Texas A&M outfielders who are going to go before the White Sox pick most likely. I think those two are pretty safe to say they're going to go in the top 7 or 8 in the draft. There's a chance one of those guys falls. I think Laviolette is the projected number 1 pick right now, whereas Canarella is more of the number 5 to 6 range. One of those, Canarella maybe could fall. Realistically, those two are not going to be there, unfortunately, come the White Sox pick, in which case the next guy I was looking at that I need to do more research on this aspect. I can't say I'm super deep into this draft class yet. I've just started to look into it. But Brendan Summerhill from Arizona is one, and then Devin Taylor from Indiana. I think Devin Taylor from Indiana is somebody to definitely keep an eye on out because it's a Midwest guy, right? Super in the Big Ten. The White Sox have very close proximity to him. He had an extremely good season, at Indiana, and is someone who, is looked to be a very good blend of power and plate approach in college, which is exactly what the White Sox have been targeting. So in terms of college guys, the first person that sticks out to me is Devin Taylor, potentially. Jeff, anybody that you found that you were, looking at for the draft?
Elijah, I don't pretend to follow the college hitters and know who the best ones are. I know that that's something that you have an interest in, and our colleague James Fox is all over
Yes, for
that.
sure.
He knows it backward and forward. So I defer to you two guys.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I defer to James even more. James knows more than I do, and we've had people on the show before. We'll get our guy Pete Flaherty on here at some point, come draft time, like we did last year. A friend of mine who works for Baseball America, who does excellent draft coverage. But to answer your question, I think the logic there is completely true. The White Sox are going to continue to target some outfield prospects, some guys with some really big hitting upside, right? Braden Montgomery's your key outfield prospect now after that trade. You've got guys like George Walkow in the system who are, long-term projects, right? But I think at that 10th pick, looking at an outfielder and particularly, ideally, a college outfielder, right? Unless the White Sox want, unless they have somebody high schooler that they really want to spend big on there, right? Given that they'll be picking at the first pick of the rest of the rounds, right? From the second to 20th round, the White Sox will have the first pick of those rounds because they were the worst team in baseball, obviously, worst team ever. But at that 10th pick, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at some outfielders. Devin Taylor is the first one that stood out to me, but like I said, I got to keep diving more into this draft class. And I think that, going back to the last question too, talent over position still. I think that's where the White Sox are, right? So yes, target some outfield prospects, but I do think the priority above all else will be just talent and just, the ability to add upside hitting in general, regardless of position. But that Devin Taylor would be my answer as of right now. But a lot of time to come. We got to see how the college season shakes out. So we'll see how all that goes. But that's another great question there.
Yeah, for sure.
Moving on to the next. This one comes from Jonah of 365. Another great follower. Shout out to Jonah. You're always great to engage with on Twitter. Do you guys see anyone that was signed in IFA the last 2 to 3 years that could be a breakout candidate and turn into a serious or top 100 prospect for the White Sox? Jeff, take it away here. I'm very curious to hear what you've got to say about this one, because it's interesting. You're right. The White Sox just overhauled their entire international scouting department, right? So we're going to see a whole new generation, an era of international prospects, right? There's been a lot of international prospects the past years that have not worked out particularly well. So it's going to be interesting the next few years to see what happens. But anybody in the past few years of international signings that stands out to you?
Well, I'm going to preface it by saying drafting in general is a crapshoot, but the international draft is very much a crapshoot because these guys are so young. I mean, some of these
Yeah.
guys are like 16, maybe if you're lucky, 17. And
Yep.
so a lot of them are very intriguing, but man, you're really rolling the dice. And, you can look back at Oscar Colas, Mike Adolfo. I mean, all these guys come in
Yep.
and they're exciting and just don't appear to be panning out. So it's a big crapshoot. The other thing I'm going to say is, we know about Mogollon. Hopefully, we'll get to see him at some point. But there are just a lot of other guys from the DSL that I just know nothing about, other than the class from like 2 years ago that was so good is just now starting to trickle into the
Right.
affiliates. So
Yeah, so it's hard when you say in the past 2-3 years from international signings, like we haven't seen a lot of these guys yet, right? So it's really tricky because a lot of these guys are playing in the DSL. I try to look in on DSL stats and stuff, but I don't have videos, some substantive videos or anything from the DSL, so it's a little tricky to figure out what those guys are. The clear answer is Mogollon, right? I think Javier Mogollon is the one that jumps out to me when I first think of this question and try to just think through it. Javier Mogollon is a guy that has flashed some serious power and upside in the Arizona Complex League last year, right? He's shown a combination of speed, power, a little bit of just general juice, right? I mean, I think last year he played 46 games in Arizona last year, had a 930 OPS, carried by a 406 on base percentage, right? He gets a ton of walks, patient approach, right? But striked out a lot of strikeouts last season. Definitely has a big swing, needs to compact that a little bit. But I think at the least we're going to see Mogollon, his combination of power and speed. We're going to get to see that hopefully at some point in Kannapolis this year. I think he's due for some time in the affiliates. I think he'll make his way to Kannapolis pretty early this season. And Mogollon's the one guy I think that stands out to me as someone who could really take a big step forward. And if he takes a big step forward, top 100 is probably too lofty for him, given what he's done so far. But, when some guys that were international signings, when they make their affiliated debuts, if they really show a lot, it can put them on radars pretty quickly, considering he's not a guy that's on a bunch of radars right now. So I could see Mogollon being the guy that jumps out to me as a high upside potential, international signing. Another one, Abraham Nunez. I'm not sure if that's a name many people are familiar with, but Abraham Nunez is a guy who was in that 2023 class, I believe. I'm pulling up his stuff right now. Last year played in the Arizona Complex League as well with Mogollon. Not quite as gaudy numbers, definitely not elite numbers, but a lot of speed, 20 stolen bases, flashed some good, overall speed, contact skills. Not a lot of power for Nunez. I think that's the thing that probably will hold him back a little bit. Didn't have a single home run in the ACL last year, but looks like someone who can put some pretty good at bats up, solid contact and plus speed. So Abraham Nunez is another guy to mention. Right now, the reality is that I don't think there's anybody who can be a top 100 level prospect from these recent international classes. But, this current class that was just signed, right? The White Sox just announced a few weeks ago their international class for this year. Alejandro Cruz from Cuba is one of the, was ranked as the 17th prospect in this entire international class, signed for a few $1,000,000, right? So that's a guy who, was the marquee signing of this year's class, who seems to be a powerful third baseman, shortstop third baseman, a lot of pop, a lot of physical projection with him, is still kind of building and adding to his body right now. So Alejandro Cruz signed this year, another guy to keep an eye on as well.
Yep, yep. It's when they hit, they can hit big, but it's tough when they're
Yeah.
16 and 17 to project what they're going to be at 22.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky. But generally speaking, I think this international department's going in a better direction. I think they've overhauled it, they've changed it. There's a whole new staff in place. So what we can do from this point, even though there's not a ton of guys that we're looking at now as real upside pieces, we can at the very least be able to say, there's new guys coming in, there's a new regime. Let's see how this international scouting department, does over the next few years of signings and over this next few classes that we see. Going on to the next, this one comes from Zach Gonzalez, our guy who works over at the press box of the Charlotte Knights, out by Jeff, ZGonzo3 on Twitter. And Zach asked, why does it feel like Braden Montgomery is destined to be a superstar? And if Braden Montgomery takes the face of the franchise role, how much does that help Colson Montgomery's mental game? Interesting question here from Zach, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's attack the first part of that first, of why does Braden Montgomery feel destined to be a superstar? What is your, stance, Jeff, from someone who you probably haven't seen much of Braden Montgomery? We haven't seen him play a single game in the organization yet, but, someone that the White Sox very much considered with the 5th overall pick and was amazing in college the past few seasons.
Well, what I know about him is he's just this five-tool, tooled up guy who dominated in the SEC. He's got all the abilities. The big question for him, or at least for him, is his health. I mean, he's suffered a serious ankle injury, and we just want to, get a look at him and see if he's healthy and back up to speed in terms of his ability to run and I don't know the timetable. I would imagine it's going to be sooner than later that we'll see him.
Yeah. For me, it's as simple as like a former two-way player who has elite athleticism, right? The arm is exceptional, right? So you're already getting a premium right corner outfielder with a top end arm strength, right? This is a guy who was touching 97, 98 on the mound, right? So like top tier arm strength, athletic outfielder, right? And then you take that and combine it with 115 mile an hour max exit velo in college. It's a pretty good place to be. And I think he probably ends up as a lefty full time. I don't think he sticks as a switch hitter. I think I talked about this with Dylan Barnes on a podcast earlier this winter. But I think this is a guy who's been much better hitting as a lefty. Maybe he ditches the switch hitting at some point, but generally speaking, right, an aggressive swing for sure. He's someone who's been aggressive his entire college career, but has developed a lot of plate approach over the past year. I think his walk rate went up a lot in 2024. The contact skills, have looked better over time. It's just really good athleticism, strength, upside. The health matters. Yeah, for sure. We'll see what happens. I think this is a guy who's going to hit for a lot of power, and I think that is kind of the selling point, is a high-end defensive right fielder who hits for a lot of power and gets on base. He's never going to be a 300 on average guy, I don't think. I don't think the contact skills are quite there. But the White Sox need some pop. They need some pop, and they need some impact. This is a guy who, among a lot of other players in the system with a lot of, solid attributes, but not projectability necessarily, this is the projectable guy, right? Like in terms of the guy you think can be a star outfielder, like he's that guy. I think the upside's great. The second part of that question, I really don't think the face of the franchise aspect is something that I consider much. I don't think it matters too much in this context. I think Colson Montgomery is really good at dealing with the pressure that he's been facing over the past few years. I think he's had a ton of weight on his shoulders, and he does a really good job handling it. I don't think Braden becoming a star changes much for Colson, but at the same time, it never hurts to have a guy emerge as a star and take some of the pressure off of other top prospects as well.
Yeah. Elijah, I don't know if you had a chance to meet Zach when you were in Charlotte, but
I did.
he does a podcast with his father and two brothers called Big League Dreaming. That's kind of fun. They just kick around.
That's
Any,
awesome.
yeah, it's a lot of fun. They have a good time with it, and I had a chance to meet his dad, and I think one of his brothers on their visits to Charlotte. Um, the question about Colson's really intriguing, and I think regardless how much of a star Montgomery becomes, that's going to just motivate Colson even more because Colson, I think he's a really driven, competitive guy, and really wants to do everything possible. I'm not sure I'd say to be the face of the franchise, but
Right.
to be a star and perhaps the star, and that's a great thing. I think that's what you want in your
Yeah.
star players, to be that driven. So I think it's a great thing if Montgomery pushes them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's another guy that emerges as a face, and Braden Montgomery has not been afraid to be. He seems to be a pretty sociable guy. He's on social media. He posted stuff after he was traded, right? Like he seems to have the ability to handle attention and pressure. But I think his upside is it shouldn't change anybody else's projection and anybody else's role within the franchise. I don't think, but I do think Braden Montgomery is has that superstar potential, like you mentioned in your question, Zach. So thank you for that one as well. Building off of that last one, the next question comes from Gordon Liddy G on X. What is the organization's plan at shortstop if Keefaw and other assessments are correct and that Colson can't stick at the position and ends up moving to third base? This is a tough one. We just talked about Colson and his projection. I think there is a lot of people in the baseball industry that have signaled that they think Montgomery will shift to third base eventually, even if the White Sox give him a chance off the bat at shortstop. Fascinating question for sure. Definitely something that is worth considering, but it's interesting because everybody in the White Sox organization, including Colson himself, is very adamant that Colson is a shortstop and that he's going to be a shortstop, right? That has been the indication from everyone. However, in the Arizona Fall League, with other shortstop prospects on the Glendale team, we saw Colson playing mostly third base. Whether or not the White Sox will say it or not, there's definitely some thought going into if he will end up at third base. The reality right now, though, is that you've got Brian Ramos, you've got Miguel Vargas, you've got Lenyn Sosa. These are all guys that aren't shortstops and need innings at third and or second base, right? Brooks Baldwin, another one, more of a shortstop still. What do you think if Colson can't remain at shortstop long term is the options or primary option going forward?
All right. Well, we appreciate the question from G. Gordon Liddy. Does that name ring a bell, Elijah?
No.
He was in the Nixon administration and got in a lot of trouble.
I think it's a parody name then I assume, but
I was just curious if anyone else recognized other
somebody did.
than an old coot like me. Anyway, it is a fascinating question. Who are the other shortstop candidates now? Well, certainly top of the list, Jacob Gonzalez, Brooks Baldwin, and then you've got the young guys, Ryan Burroughs, Caleb Bonnemer. You've got Chase Mydroth, who they just picked up, and that could be a sneaky answer. I really don't know what the answer is. If he moves off, maybe he's the guy who's the heir apparent to shortstop is not in the organization yet.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think there's a lot of guys that could be right on this roster, right? You look at a Brooks Baldwin. He's played a solid shortstop. Brooks Baldwin, he gets a lot of his value from his versatility, right? I think the White Sox know that. I think they want Brooks Baldwin to be that versatile piece for them. So I have a hard time seeing him as the everyday shortstop. Maybe he just becomes a stud this year and he really takes a step forward to the point where it's like, his defense is great at shortstop and you just want to put him there. Chase Meadroth has played some shortstop. Again, another guy, though, that I don't see being an everyday shortstop. For the third time this episode, Jeff, I'm coming back to the same person. I'm really am. I think there's a world where it's Sam Antonacci. I think that might be, there's a world, right? I think they're going to give Colson every chance he can to be the shortstop of this team for the future. I think that has become very clear from talking to people in the organization, from being in spring training, right? Like the White Sox want Colson to be that shortstop. If he can't be, you got to pivot. And I think you're right. It might not be from the organization. Also, another guy we talked about earlier, Caleb Bonnemer. Caleb Bonnemer has supposedly gotten really good reviews as a shortstop, right? A big dude with a lot of strength, supposedly, and still looking to add more body to him, in which case he also is another guy that's been like, oh, maybe he shifts to third. I think the baseball industry in general has gotten really into this whole, like, oh, if he doesn't stick at shortstop, he just put him at third base. Like, sure, like, yes, I get it. But like these guys that come in as shortstops want to be shortstops. And a lot of them are capable of being shortstops. But again, it is also the most demanding infield position, and it's challenging, and it's the anchor of your infield defense to an extent, right? I think Antonacci and I think Bonnemer, both very different trajectories, right? I think Antonacci is 1 year out as opposed to, or 2 years out, maybe even. And Bonnemer is still probably 4 years out from the big leagues, right? So I think you have two guys behind Colson in the pipeline that could be, right? I still think Jacob Gonzalez is in consideration there. I do think Jacob Gonzalez is probably more of a third base or a second baseman, pardon me, than a shortstop long term. He's going to be in consideration there at the very least. There's a number of other guys in the organization that are shortstops, right? I think you look at Alexander Albertus, who came over from the Dodgers last year, William Bergoya, who came over from the Phillies last year, right? There's a handful of guys that can play shortstop. If it's not Antonacci or Bonnemer, though, I kind of lean, it's not on the team yet. And that's not a bad thing, right? If Colson Montgomery sticks at third base long term and becomes an elite third baseman, then you figure it out from there, right? You keep moving. You got to find talent above all else right now with this organization. And I think Colson has a shot to stick there. I think both Antonacci and Bonnemer could also have a shot to become, that shortstop. If not, it's probably still someone you haven't drafted yet or haven't traded for yet, or maybe the team is competitive in a year or two and they sign a big shortstop, right? Like there's possibilities there. We've seen in the past few years, a lot of shortstops in Major League Baseball have gone elsewhere in free agency, the top shortstops, right? Almost every top shortstop in the league, other than, the homegrown ones like a Bobby Witt and a Gunnar Henderson, right? A lot of other guys from Trey Turner to Carlos Correa to Dansby Swanson, right? Have all ended up signing huge deals, especially because shortstop is so pivotal in this game now. We see shortstops being really, really sought after in free agency. Maybe the White Sox in a year or two from now are competitive enough where they say, hey, Colson's going to be our third baseman. Let's go sign someone, right? Like, let's go make that move.
Right.
Hard to know.
Yeah. It'll be fascinating to see how that plays out for sure. And that will have a lot of impact on the team. Yeah. But when the team is competitive in a couple of years, Luis Robert probably gone, Benintendi gone, Andrew Vaughn probably gone. They're probably not going to want to pay him in arbitration. So when this new team is constructed, and hopefully you've got Braden Montgomery in one corner outfield position, hopefully you've got another competent bat in the other corner outfield and at first and third. And if you've got those four power bats and then Caro or Teal behind the plate, you can get away with a glove first shortstop. Right. And as awful as the White Sox have been defensively, I love the idea. I think, as I've said it many times, Colson at third and a glove first shortstop, that's a strong left side of the infield. Yeah. Really,
100%. So I think, like we said, there's two guys in Antonacci and Bonnemer who I see as the most likely guys to stick at shortstop in terms of the prospects right now. But I think if Colson isn't the shortstop, I think it's probably more likely than not that it's an external addition, whether it be from a trade, from the draft. It could be this year, right? The number, the 10th overall pick this year. We just mentioned all those college outfielders, right? There's some real good college infielders this year in the draft class. It's an interesting draft class. I think the consensus is the draft is a little bit thinner than other years, but like Iva Arquette, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think I said that right. Is an Oregon State shortstop, just transferred there. He's ranked as, a top 10-ish prospect in this draft class. That could be a guy the White Sox look at. Dean Curley is another guy, Tennessee shortstop this season in the SEC. There's a lot of really interesting shortstops. So maybe number 10 overall is a college shortstop that quickly moves to the system and becomes that guy, right? Plenty of options. At the end of the day, finding a way for Colson Montgomery to be a high-level big league player is the priority first and foremost, whether it comes at third or shortstop. I'm not upset about it if he shifts to third. I think some people have this idea that it's like, oh, he's, not panning out if he doesn't stick at shortstop, right? Like, no, he could be a very good third baseman. I also think he might stick it short, right? Like he might figure it out. He hasn't been terrible defensively by any means at all. He's been working through it. He's been trying to figure out his swing. He's been trying to adjust. Last year was a big adjustment for him at the plate, right? Like, let's give him a chance. I think the White Sox are going to give him a chance, and then we'll see from there.
Yep. Yep.
Our last question comes from the Bennett K. Bennett Kroll. This guy is awesome. Definitely check out Bennett on X. A great follow for any White Sox fan. Why is Rikuu Nishida not the number one guy on any White Sox prospect list? Actually, though, how is he not even top 30 is the question from Bennett.
You want to take a first shot at this one?
Nishida, we've talked about so much this offseason because he's such a fun player. We love talking about him. He's just the electric factory that he is just somebody who gets on base all the time, crazy fast, walks a ton, just takes his an excellent approach. It's really hard to project a 5-5 player on a top 30 list. That's really what it comes down to. I know that sounds kind of silly, and people are like, oh, who cares? There's plenty of baseball players of different sizes. Look at Jose Altuve. Like, I get it. It's really, really hard to project a big league impact from a guy that doesn't have power, isn't going to hit home runs at all, and ultimately is, a utility style of player the way that he plays in general. Is he in my just missed probably at this point, the way he played last season in my top 30? Yes. Is he going to crack my top 30? No. But is he on the radar and a legit prospect? Yeah, he deserves to be because he had an incredible 2024 and he's a really, really fun player and impacts the game a lot. Like he impacts the game more than almost any hitter in the system has so far in the minor leagues, right? Great player. I would love for Nishida to be so good that he has to get on every top 30 because he was awesome last year. Got to see it at the higher levels and got to see a little more well-roundedness from his game probably for him to crack a top 30 for me.
Well, it's an interesting question and a great one to end on because what to do with Rikuu Nishida, what to do with him as a prospect and what to do with him as a potential Major League Baseball player. I've always looked at him as a long shot that I just found really fascinating. But, more and more I'm thinking there could be a place for him on a Major League roster on the bench with his ability to bunt, run, play the infield and the outfield. Personally, I'd love to see him somewhere in that 25 to 30 spot on a prospect list just to give him some love. He's just a fascinating guy and such a fun player.
Yeah, understandable. I get it. Love the question, Bennett. I think over this offseason, I've seen plenty of interviews or your feature stories on Rikuu from Scott Merkin, from Chuck Garfien, right? Like he's getting attention because he's awesome and he was incredible last season. And he's so fun to watch. And I had a great time talking to him earlier this offseason as well on an interview we did. So check that one out if you want to learn more about Nishida for people that are fascinated by him. Super cool profile. And I hope the guy keeps developing. He's going to be in Birmingham this year. I would love nothing less than for a September call up for Nishida this season. That would be awesome.
Wow. From your lips, Elijah, from your lips.
I hope so, Jeff. I hope so. This was super fun. Thank you so much to those people that sent us questions in. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for supporting us as always. We hope this was cool to kind of hear our answers to some of these questions. And yeah, we'll do this again at some point. That was a good time, Jeff.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Season's
all
coming.
Right. Yeah, season's coming around. We will talk to everyone soon, and sooner than later, we're going to be maybe doing a little live show once again in Arizona and talking to a bunch of players this spring. So if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to hit us up always online. Jeff is at AAA Jeff on X. I am at Elijah EV8 and at FutureSox for all White Sox prospect content. We'll see you next time.